Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for having us. I think a lot of you were with us last time, so I'll do a much briefer introduction to Beacon BLOC. First, my name is Mark Martinez. I'm the legal counsel and budget director for Senator Pat Jalen. And so Beacon BLOC, to really kind of quickly sum it up, is a group of staffers advocating on behalf of staffers of color, advocating on behalf of improving work conditions to better recruit, retain, and support staffers of color inside the State House, with the basic theory of change that if you lift up the people at the bottom, you lift up everybody. And so if we can create a State House in which Black staffers feel safe and supported, that should be an environment where everybody feels safe and supported. So I'll let Tara introduce herself, and then we'll hop right in.
Hi, everyone. Tara Wilson. Big shoes to fill with Maya having done this presentation before, but I'll do my best. I'm Legislative and Budget Director for Senator Susan Moran. Really happy to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And then give me just a moment. All right, everyone can see the screen. Just want to make sure. Oh, sorry. All right, so the way this is going to go, we're going to go back and forth. The first couple of slides are really just kind of background information, so I'm not expecting a whole lot of questions. But after that, once we get into the actual budget process, we're going to stop at the end of every slide for people to ask questions. And so if you have questions at that time, feel free to take yourself off of mute or drop it in the chat. What I will ask Jen, just because I can't see the chat while I'm in presentation mode, so if there are questions dropped in the chat at the end of the slides, if you could just read those out to us, that would be great.
Sure thing.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and Tara, I think you're going to start us off.
Yeah, so just to start off on what the state budget is, basically every year the state's got to decide how it's going to spend its revenue. So there's about $45 billion in the budget every year. And the budget touches basically every major impact in our cities, in our towns.
They're all great. I'm listening to them all. Can't take a break.
Hi, could you mute, please? Pardon us.
And so basically the budget touches everything that we decide to spend money on, just like the federal government. Congress has the power of the purse, so does state legislature here in Massachusetts. So schools and how much money they have, money that's allocated towards housing, shelter services, legal aid, things like that. That's all decided in the budget process. You'll hear often people say, the budget isn't supposed to be a policy document. That really couldn't be further from the truth, because how you spend your money reflects how you prioritize things. Especially when it comes to the state budget, it reflects what the state prioritizes. So if if the state feels as though they want to prioritize making sure that we don't have people living in poverty, or we don't have people who are homeless or without affordable housing, these are all things that can be addressed in the budget. The budget also includes a lot of language on where certain parts of money go, because there's the allocations and there's line items that specify how money is to be used. And in that is a tool to promote policy and to complete certain policy goals. So this very much is a huge piece of legislation that the legislature deals with every year that really sets the tone for the following year and what will be prioritized or not.
Absolutely. Real quick, I just want to, I forgot to mention at the beginning, and you'll notice their logo on all these slides. This slideshow was created in conjunction with the Young Professionals Network of the Urban League of Massachusetts. And we just want to make sure that we're lifting up the work that they put into this. They were the first group that we kind of did this budget workshop with. And so they were really important to this work. So I just want to throw this out there. So the slide here is really just what you're gonna see. We're gonna break this all down, but this is the kind of 50-foot view, 50,000-foot view, whatever you want to call it, of the budget process and where we are. And as you can see, there's lots of steps. And what that also means is there's lots of opportunities for advocacy with the budget. And we'll talk about what those opportunities are. And then towards the end of the presentation, we're also going to give some tips and tricks on advocacy and where you can plug into the process. And so where we are right now, and we'll get into this, is the section where it says the governor's budget. We're in between the governor's budget and the House Ways and Means budget. But Tara will talk about that to get us kicked off.
Yeah, so the governor's budget is either referred to as House 1 or 2, depending on what year we are in the session. So each legislative session is 2 years long. We just started a new one in January. So the governor released his budget, which is House 1. This took me a little while to get acclimated to because I didn't really understand, but it's part of, I guess, the tradition of the process. So the governor comes out with House 1 that reflects sort of his wish list of how he would like to see the budget allocated for this year, reflecting some of his priorities that he might go back to later. And then after the governor releases the budget, there will be a series of hearings with each agency or groupings of agencies to discuss what their budget priorities are, how this is reflected in the budget, and essentially in many ways sort of defend the budget that Governor Baker has put together and allow the opportunity for the legislature to find out more about what these different agencies are looking for. So there's been a couple of them so far, but they're happening right now. And it's an opportunity, I mean, each hearing is several hours long, but it's an opportunity if you're particularly interested in one set of issues to get some insight into what the agencies are thinking in terms of what they've been allocated in the budget and what they're looking forward to do next year. After that, there will be, and during this process, the public can also submit testimony.
Yeah. Sorry.
Actually, Mark and Tara, we did have a question in the chat, which is how do we see the budget? Is it, where could we view it? Is it on the governor's website? Is it on?
So if you go on to the MA Legislature website, so just malegislature.gov, which is an infinitely better website than mass.gov. But if you go, one of the tabs on that front page of the website will say state budget. And if you click on that, it's I think FY 2022 budget, and it breaks down every step and will highlight where we're at. So if you go there right now, obviously the only step that we're at is the governor's budget. So you'll be able to see what the governor submitted, which is how far we are in the process. But they do a pretty good job of updating that throughout the process. So right on the legislature's website is a great way to track where we are in the process.
I'll also add, so for the, on the governor's website also, and I'll drop the link to that in the chat, and also dropped the Mass Legislature link too. You can go through line items. They have it developed pretty well that you could search through it. Mm-hmm. And Mass Budget also has a website and a tool that we could talk about later that will help. Yeah, we've got
we've got some non-legislature based tools that are really helpful a little bit later on in the presentation. That'll help you track it from a more advocacy perspective. So yeah. All right, any other questions? Are we good to move on to the next slide?
So we got another question about what the budget director does. So basically what our roles are, if you want to answer that, and I can.
Yeah, so basically my role as budget director for my boss, and these function differently in different offices, but what I can say is, yeah, it is my job to track the budget through the whole process. Now, that does not mean that I track every single line item because that would be wild. But generally what I do is I track my boss's priorities, right? So my boss has areas of the budget that she prioritizes, that she follows much more closely than others. And so that's what I do from the very beginning, right? We find out what those priorities are. And obviously, for those of you that know my boss, so that she's been in the legislature for a while, so she has pretty well established priorities, so that from day one, I'm able to see where those different areas are funded, from the governor's budget to the House budget to the Senate budget. And so I track that. I draft any amendments that we want to draft. I help her prepare for debate on any amendments that either we file or someone else files that she wants to speak on that's important for her. And overall, just, yeah, like I said, monitoring the process in particular for those areas that are really important to my boss. And then beyond that, if there are specific areas that constituents are reaching out to us on, making sure we're tracking that as well. So that way, we can provide answers to constituents that have questions. All right. So constitutionally speaking, money bills, so bills that have to do with money have to go to the House first, which is why the House always does the budget first in the process. And so that will happen, generally speaking, sometime next month, sometime in April is when the House generally picks up the budget. Right, the caveat being that obviously if you watched or paid attention to the budget that happened last year, completely different. Everything about that was a very different process. Right, so I want to be clear that what we're talking about here, what this presentation covers, is the way that a normal budget process operates. And all indication is that we are moving back into a normal budget process. So this should be what we're seeing. So like we said, the governor files his budget, which, I just kind of call his wish list, because both House Ways and Means and Senate Ways and Means, they don't base their budget off of what the governor does, right? They have their own process and how they form their own budget. And so the governor's budget is just his way of letting the legislature know, this is what I would do with the money, and this is what you're going to have to contend with, when it comes to vetoes and stuff, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so then, right, they go through, they have meetings with all of their members to, again, figure out what are their priorities, what do you want to see funded in this, and then they release their budget package based off of all those conversations, and of course based off of what leadership finds important. They release a budget to the entire body, much like they would any other bill. Right, it comes out of Ways and Means. And this is the House saying, these are our priorities. This is what we want funded. And then once that happens, again, like any other bill, your members, your representatives, get to file amendments to that, to make changes if that budget does not line up with what they think is important. And the amendments, usually do one of four things. You'll increase a line item, add some language to a line item to make it kind of specific. Right, to give an example from last session, right, from my office, right, we filed amendments to increase the amount of money going to the RAFT program, which is the rental assistance program in the Commonwealth. Line item language is language inside of the actual line item. So inside language there is, we had some data reporting requirements on RAFT that we wanted to see, and that goes inside of it. Earmark funds for a specific purpose. So if you all have ever done advocacy around earmarks or organizations that you're a part of, that's what that is. That's right. That's saying within a specific line item, we want $50,000 to go to, the community center in our district to help them, build a new something or repave their driveway, whatever it may be, or add a policy section. And so one of the things that I want to quickly touch on that can be a little tricky is inside sections versus outside sections, which is language you'll hear a lot when we're talking about the budget, right? So inside sections means it's literally inside the line item, right? There's a line item number, there's a dollar amount, and there's language that goes after that, that indicates how we have to spend that money. That's an inside section. And inside sections are only applicable for that budget year. So if you get a language change inside of a line item, you have to do that again in the next budget if you want that language to continue, or if you want the program to continue to run that way, right? So like I said, there was some language around data collection for RAFT that we got into the budget last year. If we want to continue that data collection, we have to go in and do that again. Outside sections are things, if you watched again the budget last year, the Roe Act, right? That was one of the big things that happened in the budget. That's an outside section. That is a pure policy section that becomes a part of the general laws. We don't have to redo that again next year, right? One of the things that, Tara alluded to earlier is every year they'll come out and say, oh, we don't do policy in the budget. And that is false for two reasons. One, because just, right, the dollars and cents that we spend is policy. We can't get around that. And two, we also just legitimately do policy every year in the budget. Even though every year they tell us we don't do it, we then do policy every year. And we know that. And so they tell us it, and they do try to limit it. It has certainly been more limited in the past years than, 4 or 5 years ago, but there's always policy done in the budget, right? That's why we have an entire, if you, as you're tracking the budget, right, when the House Ways and Means puts out their budget, there'll be a whole tab underneath their budget that says outside sections. And there's a reason, and it's because there is always outside sections. And then, right, so they go through the amendment process, whether it's inside sections, outside sections, they do all of that. And then, right, that bill gets finalized, it gets a final vote. And then it gets sent over to the Senate, basically for the same process. So I just want to stop real quick. I don't know if there are questions. Oops.
All right, not seeing any questions in the chat. So now we sort of do that whole process Mark just described over again. And this is where Mark and I really start to engage in the Senate state budget process. So essentially it's the same process that the Senate Ways and Means Committee will start to develop their own proposal for the budget, and is currently having meetings with different senators to say, hey, let's go over what your priorities are for this year and what you want to see in the budget, and work to incorporate that into the document that will be the budget. Once that goes out of committee, same deal as the House, the senators will have an opportunity to go through, add amendments, debate the budget, and so on and so forth. So it gets a full sort of look through by members of the Senate. And then once it gets the full vote, and if it passes, it will then go on to the Joint Conference Committee. So again, this is really a similar process as the House. We do the same thing with the inside and outside sections. And basically Mark and I's role through this process, the budget is a ginormous document, but it's to take on the priorities of what our senators are working on, sort of track them through the process and see where they can be included in the document, because it does address everything that the state government touches on.
Yeah. So I just want to pause again to make sure. Are there any questions?
Not seeing anything so far.
Okay. Again, feel free to drop things in the chat or come up, if that's your thing. And so then, right, we go to the Joint Conference Committee, and right, in general, what a Joint Conference Committee is if there's a difference between two versions of the same bill that the House and Senate passed, the way that they reconcile those differences is through a Joint Conference Committee. And you'll see that on any number of bills. It just so happens that, right, nothing's 100%, but I can tell you with 99.9999999% certainty that the House and the Senate are never going to pass the same budget, right? And that is, again, because they do, like I said, they do these processes completely independent of each other. It's not the same way that the House isn't using the governor's budget to base their stuff off of, the Senate isn't using the House to base their version of the budget off of, right? They're very much going through this process at the same time. Right, like I said, the House is meeting with their members right now. The Senate is meeting with their members right now as well. Like I said, the House just has to go first because that's a constitutional thing. It's a money bill, so it has to go through the House first. And so the way a Joint Conference Committee works in general is the House and the Senate appoint 3 conference members to be on the conference committee. And one of those members from each body is a member from the minority party. Now for any given bill, who ends up being on a conference committee, you can kind of make some educated guesses, but you never really know. For the budget process, right, we pretty much know, right, again, with a 99.99% certainty who those conference committee members are going to be. And that's going to be the chairs of each respective chair of Ways and Means, each respective vice chair of Ways and Means, and then the ranking minority member. Right, that's who's going to be on the conference committee. So, right, I can tell you in the Senate this year, it's going to be Mike Rodriguez, it's going to be Cindy Friedman, and it's going to be, I think Ryan Fatman is the ranking minority member. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. And on the House side, I only know who Miklowicz is the chair of the House Committee on Ways and Means. I don't know the vice chair and the ranking minority member on the House side, but that's who they will be. And they create this compromise bill, right? And so they meet, and one of the criticisms of the conference committee is that they meet in private, right? These aren't open meetings. The public is not entitled to listen in to conference committee meetings. So they really hash out these deals kind of in private, behind the scenes to, like I said, bridge the differences between the two documents. And then that goes out once they reach that compromise, once they reach that conference committee report, that gets sent back to each body to then confirm. And the thing with conference committee reports, once those come back from the conference committee, and that's budget or otherwise, you can't then amend a conference committee report, right? So when a conference committee report comes back to each chamber, that's a straight up like up or down, yes or no vote, which is why it's really important that they get the conference committee reports right. Because if it's not something to make enough people happy, and there's no way to alter that document after the fact, then obviously you get into the position of people feeling like they have to vote no. And so then, right, that conference committee report is the quote unquote final budget. And then that is what gets sent off to the governor. It looks like we had a question pop up.
Yeah, so we got a question from June. Can items in the budget get squashed in committee, like individual bills which die when they are not reported out of committee?
Can you read that question to me one more time? I just want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly.
Yep. Can items in the budget get squashed in committee, like individual bills which die when they are not reported out of committee?
Yes. So if there is something that is in one budget and not in the other, right, they've got a couple different options, right? One, the conference committee can include that thing or it could not. If there's a different dollar amount, this is especially true when it comes to outside sections. Right, generally what happens with line items is it's relatively uncommon for a line item to exist in one budget and not the other, unless it's like a real small thing. For the most part, the line items are the same. It's just the funding amount is different. And so usually, right, the compromise there is not to wipe out the line item. It's usually you either fight for it, you trade, you meet in the middle, I don't know, but usually the line item is still there. Outside sections, to the policy sections, can certainly be things that just get left out altogether if one chamber is really not behind it. And then, of course, like any other bill, it could also end up being like a compromised version of whatever that policy is.
Yeah, before my role in the State House, I was an advocate, and I will tell you, when we were advocating for things that were outside sections, this was the period of time where we would get a little bit nervous that it would go into joint committee but not go out of the joint committee process. Because at that point we've sort of lost the battle. But if you've got strong advocates in the State House that are behind your priorities and continually advocating for them, hopefully they end up in the final budget. We got another question. How long does it typically take for the conference committee to complete their task?
So that really varies. So the unfortunate truth is, right, so I want to be, when we talk about, right, when we're asking these generalized questions, I think it's safe to assume that we're not talking about last year's budget, right? So like that was a complete anomaly due to COVID. Prior to that, we were pretty consistently one of the very last states in the nation to pass a budget. which is not great. That is not something we should necessarily be proud of. But the truth is, it can take months, right? What is supposed to happen is, right, the budget is supposed to be finalized by July 1st, because that's when the new fiscal year starts. 2 years ago now, so the last budget we did before COVID, I think we were until like September before the budget got approved. And so it can take a really long time. It's not supposed to, right? Like I said, the Senate finishes their budget in May, which is supposed to, again, give, a month and some change to the conference committee to ideally figure it out in that time frame. That just unfortunately has not happened recently.
We got a question from Linda that I can address. Is federal money from COVID relief included in the budget? So this is a complicated question. The answer is yes, sort of, it depends. It really depends on the language that's in the federal allocations and how that's really spread into state budgets. So these all work differently. I'll use, I'm most familiar with like the child care system, for example. So in the stimulus said, okay, let's allocate, a couple $2 billion to states to put into their child care system and essentially flow through the existing mechanisms for federal money to get to states. Because this was the case, it really just like pumped up the budget of the state agencies. So when it came to the budget process, they had more flexibility to ask for more money for certain line items because the state knew that they were taking in all of this money, and that's how it worked. For other things, it could be like grant funding or loan funding and things like that, and that would go straight from the federal government into whoever's the beneficiary, so wouldn't be specified in the budget. Mark, do you have anything to add there?
The only thing I would add, right, in a normal year, absolutely federal funds are included in the state budget, and right, which is why if you pay attention, right, the size of our budget is far larger than what we bring in for revenue, and there's lots of reasons for that, and part of it is federal dollars supplement a decent amount, especially when it comes to like Medicare reimbursements, which is where a lot of federal dollars will come from. What I will say is this, if you've been paying attention, obviously we know that as far as COVID funds, the governor has had pretty much unilateral control over where a lot of those funds have gone. And there has finally started to be talks at the legislature about passing some bills or doing something to curtail that a little bit and giving the legislature some more control over where these dollars are going. I can't tell you that's definitely going to happen. I can't tell you how that's going to happen. I just know that it is happening. I think lots of people are really fed up with a lot of the governor's handling of the pandemic and the pandemic funds. And at the very least are really upset with the lack of transparency around the funds. Right, there have been lots of money expended that we just, we don't know where it went. And we're being told it's being spent on X, Y, and Z, but we don't have the receipts.
That's a really great question though. And as you're thinking about what to advocate for, it'll be good to have at least some familiarity with what's in the federal budget. So you can sort of use that to say, hey, this, the federal budget said, this should be getting X number of dollars. So where is that? I want it to go here, and make sure that's prioritized in the process. We got a couple of other questions.
Yeah, we've got time. We don't have a whole lot of slides left, so we've got time to answer, whatever.
June said, what mechanisms exist to deal with unfunded mandates?
So
these are all good questions.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how to best answer this. So there is technically a mechanism built into, I think, the Constitution that in order for the state to pass an unfunded mandate, right, there's a higher threshold for what the state has to do. Now, granted, what I will say is when it comes to budget time, That is generally not the time in which we do unfunded mandates, because it's when we're doing all the funding. So it's a real odd time to be like, you have to do this, but no, we're not going to give you any money while we're doling out all of this money. So what I was just talking about, the kind of higher procedural thing for passing bills that are unfunded mandates to municipalities generally come through general legislation and not through the budget process. And so I'm not 100% sure what the process is for doing an unfunded mandate in the budget, just because I don't know that it comes up a whole lot. And right, but I think if what I'm thinking is kind of the essence of this question, right, is with the amount of money that has been given to us from the federal government, right, the things that we're doing shouldn't be unfunded. And that, right, leads back to the larger question of the amount of control that the legislature decides to take over these federal funds, because we're getting a lot, right? One of the big issues right now is the MBTA. The MBTA has gotten $2 billion worth of funding and they've cut service, which is absolutely wild, right? It's bad from an environment standpoint. It's bad from a public health standpoint. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. What are you doing with this $2 billion then? And we've not gotten any answers on that. And so that's just one of the many areas in which it doesn't quite line up.
This is where it all comes back to the state budget being a reflection of what we prioritize, because in moments like these where we're getting all of this extra revenue, it's where we're deciding to spend it and where we're making cuts where maybe we really should not be making them. To add to the unfunded mandate question, I would say this would be the time if there are things that you're worried about falling through the cracks or have been previously unfunded and you've noticed problems with implementation for, to raise this with your elected official, because sometimes they may not be aware or may not be aware that it's a priority for their constituents. So you'll definitely want to note these things. Hey, I want funding for X, Y, and Z item that's in this statute that passed last session. Another question we got, are the outside sections added as amendments during the floor debates?
Some of them are built in, right? I think the Roe Act was built in. I'll have to double check on that. But some policy is absolutely baked into the budget that gets released to the members before amendments. But then, of course, there's stuff that gets added or amended or edited or changed through the amendment process as well. So it's a little bit of both. I will say it is much better to have it baked into the overall budget than to try to fight to add something, but you absolutely can add things. Right? We added a bunch of housing stuff this last time around in my office that was not in there when the budget started. So, all right.
All right, I think we're going questions. So once we have this beautiful package that the legislature has put together through the different houses or the bicameralism and debate, that will then be sent to the governor for review, and the governor has 10 days to take action in a couple of different ways. So the governor can just approve and sign it, which would speed things up quite quickly. The governor can also just veto the whole thing. The governor can also veto or reduce specific line items. So this is something that he did last year, and Mark would know better than I, but I think is a frequent strategy. So particular line items, essentially take a pen, cross it out and say, I don't want this funding. And sometimes he'll also take the strategy of within specific line items, trying to cross out language, but that's very legally tenuous, so not totally valid. And he can also propose additional changes and amendments to add to the existing budget for the legislature to then consider. So if vetoes or any changes are made, the governor doesn't have the unilateral authority to say, let me make this change, sign it, and then we're good. It'll have to go back to the state legislature to continue to either incorporate those changes and vote on that, or what typically happens with a supermajority vote, override those vetoes and send it back to be implemented.
Questions?
So we got one question, which I think you're going to address in the next slide. What happens if he lets it sit with no action?
Yes. So like any other, if the governor lets a bill sit for 10 days, it becomes law, just becomes law without his signature. Right. Which is, it's a weird thing. It doesn't happen very often, and it's certainly not going to happen with a budget, right? Like Tara mentioned, he almost always comes back. So what I will say is, 2 budgets ago, so the 2019 budget, for the first time, maybe ever, the governor did not line item veto anything. There was a couple policy sections that he changed, and I think truly like 5 or 6, but he reduced 0 funding for anything, which was just kind of wild and unheard of. My theory on that, and this is solely a theory from Mark Martinez, not anybody else, is this was all in the midst of the RMV scandal. And one of the big issues that happened with the RMV is like they just were underfunded and understaffed. And so I think that after all of that happening, which is a bad look for the governor to then slash line items from various departments. So I think he just kind of left that one alone. But that's just my theory. Maybe he just really liked the budget. I don't know. Who knows? And so, yeah, a couple of things. Right, the budget is a very particular bill because the governor has the ability, like we said, for that line item veto, which is where you can come in and rather than just have to like strike a whole thing or leave it alone, you can say, oh, instead of 10 million, I want to give this 5 million. Or instead of reducing funding, I'm going to increase funding. And then those go back to the legislature for an override. Right, which we had to override a couple of things last budget session, right? He vetoed in one form or another, vetoed or changed pretty much all of our housing provisions that we had secured. And so we successfully overrode all of those vetoes, which is good. He vetoed some stuff around decarceration that we had to override. And then some funding stuff, right, where you wanted to cut fundings for certain things, we had to override it, right? And so like with anything else, those overrides come with a 2/3 majority in both chambers, which is why it can be a little tricky sometimes. And yeah, so that's how vetoes pertain to the budget, right? When we talk about pocket vetoes, those are right when the governor doesn't sign a bill that was passed within the last 10 days of session, but that's not super relevant to the budget conversation. If people have questions about pocket veto, we're happy to chat about it. But that's not a thing that happens in the budget process because it's always happened so early in the year.
All right, no questions in the chat.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, 1 second. And here we are.
All right, now we get to the fun stuff about how you all can affect the state budget. So basically, your role starts now or has already really started because the state legislature is in the process as we speak of compiling and working with their Ways and Means committees to talk about their priorities and what they find important. A lot of this comes from emails, calls, meetings with constituents and organizations who are saying to them, you know, this is what we need for the budget from this year, or this is where we were lacking this year and we just need support in this way. So you can start at that point already sort of emailing your state reps or senators and telling them what you find important. From that stage, pretty consistent communication with your reps and senators will be necessary to make sure that you're watching through the state budget process, what's happening, what you find important, making sure that's prioritized. I was previously in an advocacy role before this, and one thing I want to emphasize to you guys is for each, for the role that Mark and I are in, there's so much that the state budget touches that we may have a very in-depth understanding of certain parts of it, but the budget touches so much that you all can come and say, look, I've got these stats, I've got these figures about why this wasn't enough. Let us know. And that's something that we raise to our bosses to let them know, because there's so much going on. Sometimes things can fall through the cracks if we don't get emails like that. This is a really long process. So of course, there's always points earlier in the process is more flexibility to develop sort of the document that you want to see. So right now, a lot of stuff is up in the air in terms of what we want prioritized. There's stuff that we're already hearing about and putting that together, but that's much different than when you're coming in, as votes or debates are happening, and this is already sort of a well-formed document. You can't really like flip something over on its head, or maybe you can, but it's a more uphill battle from that point. What I would recommend is, because this process is happening right now, starting to track and read through things that you're interested in and where it is in the budget. There's a couple of resources that are available. So we talked a little bit about the legislature and governor's website. And then my favorite tool is the Mass Budget browser, because it's a lot more user-friendly. I will drop the link in the chat.
Yeah, the great thing about the Mass Budget browser is it allows you to track line items over the years. Right, so it really allows you to get a great kind of historical context of how have we funded these things in the past, what has that led to, which is a really good way to advocate on an issue, because that's going to be one of my first questions, right? If someone sits down to talk to me about a line item and how they want this line item funded, right? One of my first questions is, all right, how has it been funded in the past, right? Are we asking, right? Because there's a big difference between asking for level funding and asking for a 2% increase versus a 50% increase, right? And that doesn't mean we can't ask for a 50% increase, but right, we want to make sure that there's a reason, right? Like we're going to be asking for major funding increases for things like raft and emergency shelter, right? But that is because it is very much needed. Whereas, some other things, maybe that's not the priority this year. And so Mass Budget really allows you to get a larger perspective of kind of where we've been and where we're going with various line items.
I also like Mass Budget and the governor's website too, because they're both searchable. So you can put in terms for if you're looking for a specific subject area, because once you start getting into line item numbers and different agencies, it can all get a little overwhelming, but those tools can be really helpful to break down what's being spent on what. Mass Budget does a great job of color coding things, so it's easy to figure out what is where, and like Mark was saying, historic budget spending, which is really interesting to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to take this kind of slide to just like really clearly like demarcate like the opportunities for engagement with your reps and your senators, right? And so, and Tara, right, mentioned this as well, but right, so right now you've got the opportunity, right? So right now in the process is when you are asking your reps and your senators to ask their respective Ways and Means Committee to prioritize certain line items, right? That's the ask right now. And then after that, after the budget comes out, if it's not there, then you're asking your House members, for your reps first, then your senators to either file an amendment or support an amendment that's being filed to the line item that you care about. That's the second opportunity, right? Then we go into the conference committee. What every single one of your reps and senators will do once the conference committee starts is send a letter to the conference committee members saying, hey, here's what's important to me and here's what I want you to fight for in the conference committee. So you can advocate with your reps and your senators to make sure that they are advocating to the conference committee for things, right? So if it's like the House does a better job on this, but the Senate does a better job on this, right? We'll send a letter saying that, right? Fund this according to what the Senate requested, fund this according to what the House, it's the Senate's version of this outside section. So you can advocate for that with your reps and your senators. And then, of course, right, you can, I don't know what it's like to advocate and lobby the governor's office. It doesn't sound like it's a productive use of time, but That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you not to do it. It's just not an area that I'm familiar with. But then right after the governor vetoes things, right, then your kind of last stop of advocacy is lobbying your rep and your senator to override the governor's vetoes that you don't like. And so there are opportunities to plug into this all over the place. Like Tara said, though, the earlier that you are in, the more flexible and the more likely it is for something to get done. Because as we move further in the process, the budget starts to become a little bit more and more set in stone. So it becomes a little bit harder to change out.
For the sections themselves too, there's, and especially, this is especially true in outside sections, there's language for each line item, and sometimes that, creates additional requirements that go with that money. It's good to pay attention to that because you can really dictate where the spending will go. So I'll give an example. In my previous role, we were advocating for the state to pay childcare fees for childcare subsidies for the rest of the year because with all of the financial instability with housing and everything else, and parent fees are very expensive for childcare, obviously, even with a voucher. We wanted to make sure that that was paid for through the remainder of the fiscal year. We had worked with the agency previously and talked to them about it, but we're not able to get them to agree to do that. And we're, nervous that there would be this pot of money allocated. Part of it would be spent to pay parent fees about halfway through the year, and then they would stop whenever they sort of decided that the crisis was over, aka what's happening right now to a certain extent. So we looked at the line item, or we looked at the outside section that had the parent fees and said, okay, can we introduce language to say those parent fees must be paid for through the remainder of the fiscal year? Worked with senators that represented our districts, with the clients that we worked with, and were able to successfully insert that language to make sure that was secured and make it so we were certain that that would be protected in the budget. We got a couple of questions. So from Jennifer, yep.
Yeah.
So for bills, we need to advocate for specifically. For the budget, can we ask for several line items that relate to one topic area?
Absolutely. Right. So I know like when we go into our meetings with Ways and Means, right, we have to list other line items, but basically, right, we'll be like, we need to fund housing. And so we know that that's RAF, and that's MRVP, and that's AHVP, and that's emergency shelter. And that's all of the things that come in with that. So absolutely, right? If you don't know and you don't have the bandwidth, right, I want to be clear. We're here to help kind of demystify the budget process, and hopefully that's helping, but it's still a really confusing thing. And I don't expect any of our constituents to necessarily call up and have line items ready to go. But they can absolutely call up and say, hey, I'm really worried about housing. I want to make sure that we're putting all the money into housing that we can, and that can happen a lot of different ways. Same thing, right? Childcare, healthcare, all of these things all come in multiple different ways. What I will say is, especially for these bigger issues, right? Housing is what I do best and what I do most, so that's just where my brain keeps on going. But for most of these, there are already organizations that are doing this advocacy, and so they will have fact sheets on these are the line items, and this is the specific amount that we're requesting. So don't think that you have to recreate the wheel, right? You all, right, I think by virtue of being, members of the League of Women Voters are likely connected to other advocacy organizations that are doing work. And so the ones that do work around issues that are in the budget, which is most of them, if not all of them, if you reach out and say, hey, I really care about the issues that you're advocating on, and their specific budget requests that you're asking for, they will almost certainly have them. And then you can just, right, you can send that fact sheet over to your senator or your rep. And then, right, I would add a specific kind of, which is going to get into this slide, but add a specific note about why it is important to you. Right. And so some advocacy tips that you can see here. Right, personalized emails and direct calls to offices, right? One of the great things about this virtual space that we're in is it makes it super easy to advocate on things, right? We have all these things, right? Click here and send an email to your legislator, right? And we get those, and we get those by the hundreds. And those are important, right? If we're getting 100 emails on a topic, but you are a lot more likely to get a response if you are sending us a personal message. If we are just getting a bunch of chain emails, we're going to do our best to get back to you, and different offices do that differently. But if you aren't coming through with the exact same subject line and the exact same message as everybody else, it's a lot easier. And what I'll say is also just on the back end, for a lot of the systems like that we use to process emails and categorize them, they're actually set up to automatically take chain and like similar and identical emails and just kind of like put them together in a batch, just so you got 100 of these or you got 50 of these. And so if you have something personalized, and use the form that people are sending, don't reinvent the wheel, but if you put in a little bit more time to say, this is really important to me for this reason, you're a lot more likely to get a response. Feel free to ask for a call back. Be like, hey, I care about this. I'd love to get a call back or an email back to know where the senator is on this. With a caveat, because I am a staffer, I want to be clear, it is well within your right to ask for a conversation and make sure you're asking to be contacted back. But be patient with us. We are busy. We are all still working in a pandemic. We don't have all the stuff that we normally would if we were in the office. And budget season is just a really busy time for us. My inbox gets blown up all day, and my bosses especially. So just know that for the most part, we're trying to get back to you. It takes a little bit of time. But if you feel like you're not being listened to and you are being ignored, don't be afraid to follow up, but just maybe not the next day. Give us a little bit of time. Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of a more high level. This is like a theoretical thing, right? I always like to lead with kind of a theory of change. And so the kind of strategies, these should be numbered 1, 2, 3, not necessarily 1, 1, 1, but that's fine, right? Stopping the bad and building the new is the budget is such an incredible opportunity to do new and exciting things. And stopping bad things from happening is good and needs to happen, but we also need to make sure that we're doing more than just stopping and building. Divesting from their power, this is all it's a money bill. This is about investment, this is what are we investing in, and one of the things that continuously gets advocated for that I believe in is how do we get more money into the hands of communities. The state doesn't know what's happening all over the state, we all know there are very distinct regions of the state, and the budget should not be a way for the state to necessarily exert power, but to spread power. And we don't always do that. Change the rules. Like we said, we've laid out these very rigid rules about what this budget process is. And that's just because it's what the budget process has always been. It doesn't mean what it's always going to be. And so, we can still work within the rigidity of this because it's necessary and it's needed, while still acknowledging that this is not a great process and it does not invite a whole lot of people in. And that's really, really bad for such an important thing, I don't like to say, people will say the budget is the most important thing we do every year. I don't think anything that we do is the most important, but this is absolutely critical. And so it should be more inviting. It should be far more accessible. Stay in touch. Obviously that has YPN stuff, but Beacon BLOC, we've got a website, we've got a Gmail, we're on social media. So please feel free to reach out. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are some questions that we.
I think there was one more. So do Advocacy org send to the entire conference committee?
Generally, advocacy. So Tara, I'll let you, I don't know what advocacy organizations do. What I will tell you is on the Senate side, we're only sending letters to the Senate conference committee members. And on the House side, they're doing the same. Yeah, we'll drop, we can, real quick, sorry, there's a question about the links. We'll also share the slideshow that has the links in it. And so that can get sent out.
In
And
terms of
Tara.
what advocacy organizations do, it really sort of depends on what their, what your relationships are and with your various elected officials and what their role is in the process. So when you search someone on the Mass Legislature page, you'll be able to see what committees there are and if they're on Ways and Means. And from there, you can really tell what the best positioning is. I'll say the best thing you can do is reach out to your elected official who, as their constituent, will prioritize the issues that you're trying to raise for them and asking them to follow up with the committee to make sure that your interest area is included in the budget. Or if you're advocating on a particular issue and you know that there is a rep or senator that's very involved with that issue and into it, like education or housing or something else, you can also reach out to them and ask them, hey, can you make sure that this is prioritized because we know that you're a go-to person on this issue.
Any last minute questions?
Great. Thank you so much. This was wonderful and amazing. So we really appreciate your time. We're so grateful to be in partnership with you. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Always a good time. Always happy to come back. I think at this point we've covered everything that we can about the process. Well, like we said, Jen, I'll send you the slideshow so that you can send those out with the links for everybody.
Thank you.
And yeah, as always, reach out if you have follow-up questions or if you're part of another organization that you think may benefit from these presentations, please let us know. Like I said, we talked about how part of Beacon BLOC's mission is to better support staff inside of the building, but another part of it is also very much to demystify the building. So we don't see those issues as disconnected, right? We see part of the reason that we don't get a lot of staffers of color inside of the building is because communities of color don't see the State House as a solution. They see it as a very confusing and unwelcome place. And so part of our job is to demystify that and open it up. Because this can only be made better by more people participating and more people understanding what it is. And so we are happy to do that work and continue to do that work. So let us know, reach out.
Great, thank you. And that's our mission, empowering voters. Yeah. So we're here for that, believe me.
Absolutely.
Hopefully one day we can explain the whole process and it won't take an hour.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you. We're in it. We love this stuff. So thank you very much, everyone. Good night. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.